Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what American history topic you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy these relaxing deep dives into history, please consider subscribing to Sleepy America and sharing this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. Your support helps us continue creating long, immersive stories that make history easier to understand and easier to fall asleep to. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let's travel back to a time before railroads connected a continent. Long before steel rails stretched across the continent, before locomotives carried passengers from coast to coast, and before railroad companies became some of the most powerful institutions in American history, the United States faced a simple but enormous problem. The nation was growing faster than it could move. Imagine living in the early 19th century and wanting to travel just a few hundred miles. Today, such a journey might take a few hours. In 1800, it could require days or even weeks. Roads were often muddy, rough, and unreliable. Rivers helped when they flowed in the right direction, but they connected only certain places. Vast distances separated farms, towns, and cities. Yet within a single century, America would create one of the largest railroad networks ever built. Those railroads would connect oceans, reshape the economy, create fortunes, influence politics, transform daily life, and help turn a young republic into an industrial giant. Tonight, we begin that story at a time when railroads did not yet exist, when transportation was slow, uncertain, and often exhausting. To understand why railroads became so important, it helps to imagine the United States as it appeared shortly after the American Revolution. The new nation was ambitious, but it was still relatively small. Most Americans lived along the Atlantic coast. Cities such as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston served as centers of trade and government. Beyond those coastal regions stretched enormous areas of forests, mountains, rivers, and frontier settlements. The Appalachian Mountains formed one of the first great barriers to movement. While not as high as the Rocky Mountains, they created significant obstacles for travel and commerce. Farmers living west of the mountains often found it difficult to transport their goods to eastern markets. Transportation was one of the defining challenges of the age. A farmer might produce grain, livestock, or other products in abundance. Yet those goods had little value if they could not reach customers. Transportation costs often determined whether a farmer earned a profit or suffered a loss. In many regions, roads were little more than dirt paths. During dry weather, they could be dusty and uneven. During rainy seasons, they could become deep fields of mud. Heavy wagons frequently became stuck. Horses and oxen worked hard simply to move supplies over relatively short distances. Travelers often described long journeys as physically exhausting experiences. Stagecoaches bounced over rough roads. Passengers endured discomfort for days at a time. Delays were common. Bad weather could turn a planned journey into a prolonged ordeal. Water transportation offered advantages whenever it was available. A boat could move far more cargo than a wagon. Rivers therefore became the highways of early America. Communities located along major waterways often prospered because transportation costs remained lower than those faced by inland settlements. The Mississippi River system played a particularly important role. Together with the Ohio and Missouri rivers, it formed one of the world's great transportation networks. Farmers could float goods downstream toward major markets. However, rivers had limitations. Many rivers did not connect the places Americans wished to reach. Some flowed in the wrong direction. Others contained rapids, waterfalls, or seasonal obstacles. Transportation remained fragmented and inefficient. As the population increased, these limitations became more serious. The United States experienced remarkable growth after independence. Families moved westward in search of land and opportunity. New states entered the Union. Frontier settlements expanded into towns and eventually into cities. Political leaders understood that transportation was not merely an economic issue. It was also a national concern. A large republic required connections between its regions. Citizens needed ways to exchange goods, ideas, and information. Government officials worried that distant territories might become isolated if transportation remained poor. One of the first major attempts to solve the transportation problem came through the construction of canals. A canal is an artificial waterway built by human labor. By connecting rivers, lakes, and commercial centers, canals could create new transportation routes where nature had provided none. Perhaps the most famous example was the Erie Canal. Completed in 1825, the Erie Canal connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie. The project linked New York City with the interior of North America in a way that had never before been possible. Its impact was dramatic. Transportation costs dropped significantly. Trade increased rapidly. New York City strengthened its position as the nation's leading commercial center. Towns along the canal experienced growth and prosperity. The success of the Erie Canal inspired enthusiasm throughout the country. Other states launched canal projects of their own. Investors poured money into transportation improvements. For a time, many Americans believed canals represented the future. Yet even as workers dug channels through forests and fields, another technology was beginning to attract attention across the Atlantic Ocean. That technology was the railroad. The story actually begins in Britain. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Britain was undergoing the Industrial Revolution. Factories, machines, and new methods of production transformed the economy. Industrial growth created increasing demand for efficient transportation. Early rail systems had existed in primitive forms for centuries. In mining regions, workers sometimes used wooden rails to guide carts. These systems reduced friction and made heavy loads easier to move. Over time, engineers improved the concept. Wooden rails gave way to iron rails. Horse-drawn carts evolved into more sophisticated vehicles. Then inventors began experimenting with steam power. Steam engines were among the most important inventions of the age. By converting heat into mechanical motion, steam engines could perform work previously done by humans or animals. Factories adopted them. Ships began using them. Inventors soon realized they could also power vehicles moving along rails. One of the most influential pioneers was George Stephenson. Stephenson's locomotives demonstrated that steam-powered rail transportation could be practical, reliable, and commercially successful. His achievements attracted international attention. News traveled across the Atlantic. American politicians, investors, engineers, and entrepreneurs watched developments in Britain with growing interest. They recognized that railroads might solve transportation problems that canals could never fully overcome. Unlike canals, railroads were not limited by waterways. Tracks could cross hills, forests, and open countryside. Trains could operate throughout the year. They could travel in directions that rivers never flowed. The possibilities seemed almost revolutionary. Yet many people remained skeptical. Some doubted that locomotives would prove safe. Others questioned whether they could operate economically. Critics argued that canals already served transportation needs effectively. Few people could yet imagine the profound changes that railroads would bring. The debate would soon move from theory to reality. Within a few years, ambitious Americans would begin building the nation's first railroads. Their experiments would launch a transportation revolution that would gradually connect distant regions, reshape commerce, and alter the course of American history. And as the young nation continued its westward growth, the Iron Road would begin its remarkable journey across the continent. In the early decades of the 19th century, most Americans still thought of transportation in familiar ways. People traveled by horse, wagon, stagecoach, riverboat, or canal boat. These methods had been used for generations. They were imperfect, but they were understood. The railroad was something different. To many people, it seemed strange, experimental, and perhaps even a little dangerous. The idea that a machine powered by steam could pull heavy loads across the countryside at speeds greater than a horse appeared almost unbelievable. Newspapers reported on developments in Britain with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Some readers were excited. Others were doubtful. Yet beneath the debate, powerful economic forces were already pushing America toward change. The country was expanding rapidly. New farms appeared farther inland. New towns emerged beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Merchants wanted access to larger markets. Manufacturers wanted faster ways to ship goods. Investors searched for opportunities that could generate enormous returns. Transportation remained the great obstacle. A farmer living 100 miles from a major market often faced transportation costs so high that profit became difficult. Goods could be produced efficiently, but moving them remained expensive. This challenge encouraged experimentation. One of the earliest railroads in the United States was the Granite Railway in Massachusetts, established in the 1820s. It was not a passenger railroad in the modern sense. Instead, it helped transport heavy granite used for construction projects. The concept was simple. Iron rails reduced friction. Heavy loads could move more easily than on ordinary roads. Even before steam locomotives became common, railroads demonstrated their practical value. At roughly the same time, merchants in Baltimore began worrying about the future of their city. Baltimore was one of America's important ports, but it faced increasing competition from New York. The success of the Erie Canal had given New York a powerful connection to the interior. Goods from western regions could move efficiently through New York's transportation network. Baltimore's business leaders feared being left behind. Their response would help change American history. In 1827, investors established the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, usually known as the B&O Railroad. The goal was ambitious. The railroad would connect Baltimore with the growing western regions beyond the Appalachian Mountains. If successful, it would strengthen the city's commercial position and create new opportunities for trade. At the time, few people fully understood what such a project would require. Large-scale railroad construction had never been attempted in the United States. Engineers faced questions that had no easy answers. How should tracks be built? What routes should be chosen? How could steep grades be managed? How would rivers be crossed? What kind of locomotives would be needed? The B&O began cautiously. Early operations often relied on horses rather than steam engines. Cars moved along rails, but the technology remained in transition. Many people viewed the railroad as an interesting experiment rather than a transportation revolution. That perception began to change as steam locomotives improved. American engineers closely studied British developments. They imported ideas, adapted designs, and experimented with their own innovations. One important milestone came in 1830. That year, a locomotive called the Tom Thumb was tested on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The machine was designed by Peter Cooper, an inventor and entrepreneur who believed strongly in the future of steam-powered transportation. The Tom Thumb was relatively small by later standards, but it demonstrated something important. A steam locomotive could operate successfully on American tracks. Stories about the locomotive spread widely. One famous account described a race between the Tom Thumb and a horse-drawn rail car. Although the details have become part legend and part history, the event captured public imagination. People began to realize that steam power might truly represent the future. As railroads expanded, public reactions varied. Many Americans were fascinated. Crowds gathered to watch locomotives arrive. Newspapers described the machines in enthusiastic language. For people accustomed to horse-powered travel, the sight of a steam locomotive could be astonishing. Others remained cautious. Some worried about safety. Locomotives produced smoke, sparks, and noise. Critics questioned whether passengers should travel at such speeds. A few observers even speculated that the human body might not tolerate rapid movement. Today, those concerns may sound unusual, but they reflected genuine uncertainty. Every transformative technology appears strange at first. The same nation that would later embrace automobiles and airplanes initially debated whether rail travel was practical. Meanwhile, railroad builders confronted difficult realities. Constructing tracks required enormous amounts of labor. Workers cleared forests, leveled ground, built embankments, and created bridges. In many places, terrain presented significant challenges. Mountains, rivers, and valleys complicated construction efforts. Financing also posed problems. Railroads required substantial investment long before profits could be earned. Investors had to believe that future traffic would justify present expenses. Some projects succeeded. Others struggled. Speculation became increasingly common as excitement about railroads spread. State governments often played important roles. Many political leaders viewed transportation improvements as essential for economic growth. Public support, loans, and other forms of assistance sometimes helped railroad companies secure funding. This relationship between government and transportation would remain important throughout railroad history. By the 1830s, railroads were beginning to appear in multiple regions of the country. Although canals still carried large volumes of traffic, the advantages of rail transportation became increasingly clear. Unlike canals, railroads could operate during winter in many areas. Unlike rivers, they were not limited by natural waterways. Unlike wagons, they could move large amounts of freight efficiently. Railroads were not yet dominant, but they were proving their value. As track mileage increased, another important change began to occur. Travel itself started to feel different. For most of human history, speed had been constrained by the abilities of animals or the flow of water. Journeys were measured in days, weeks, or months. Railroads compressed distance. Places that once seemed far apart suddenly became more accessible. Merchants could reach new markets. Families could travel more easily. News could move more quickly. Economic relationships began to expand beyond local regions. A farmer might now sell products farther from home. A manufacturer could reach customers in distant states. Commercial networks grew larger and more interconnected. This transformation occurred gradually, but its long-term consequences were profound. The railroad was doing more than moving people and goods. It was changing how Americans thought about space, distance, and opportunity. Yet the railroad industry remained young. Tracks were often short and disconnected. Different companies pursued different standards. Technology continued to evolve. Engineers learned through experience, sometimes making costly mistakes along the way. Still, momentum was building. During the 1830s and 1840s, railroad construction accelerated. Investors became more confident. Communities competed for connections. Political leaders debated routes and funding. The nation was beginning to recognize that the railroad was not merely another transportation improvement. It was becoming the foundation of a new economic system. In the decades ahead, railroads would spread across thousands of miles, reshape entire regions, and help create a truly national market. But before that could happen, Americans would need to solve the many challenges that came with building a railroad nation. By the middle of the 1830s, a quiet but powerful transformation was underway across the United States. Railroads were still new enough to attract curious crowds, yet they were no longer merely experiments. Business leaders, politicians, farmers, and investors increasingly saw them as practical tools capable of reshaping the nation's future. The United States at this time was a country in motion. Its population was growing rapidly. New states were joining the Union. Settlers continued moving westward. Towns that had been small frontier communities only a generation earlier were becoming important commercial centers. This growth created opportunities, but it also created problems. A larger nation required better connections. Farmers needed access to markets. Manufacturers needed reliable transportation for raw materials and finished goods. Merchants needed faster ways to move products between regions. Every year, the limitations of older transportation systems became more apparent. Canals remained valuable, but they were expensive to build and difficult to maintain. Many froze during winter. Rivers remained essential, but they could not reach every destination. Railroads offered something different. They could go where people wanted them to go. If investors were willing to provide money and workers were willing to provide labor, tracks could be laid across forests, plains, valleys, and hills. As confidence increased, railroad construction accelerated. During the 1830s and 1840s, dozens of railroad companies appeared across the country. Some were successful. Others failed. But together they helped establish a new transportation network that expanded year after year. One of the most interesting features of early railroad development was that there was no single national plan. Unlike later interstate highway systems, America's railroads were largely built by private companies pursuing their own goals. A city wanted better access to trade. Investors saw a chance to earn profits. Farmers hoped for larger markets. Local communities wanted economic growth. Each group had its own reasons for supporting railroad construction. As a result, the railroad map developed in a somewhat uneven fashion. Different companies built different lines. Some connected major cities. Others linked agricultural regions to nearby markets. Many projects reflected local priorities rather than national strategy. This created opportunities, but it also created complications. One major problem involved track gauges. Gauge refers to the distance between the rails. Today, most railroads use a standard gauge, allowing trains to move easily from one system to another. In the early years, however, there was little agreement. Different companies often selected different gauges. As a result, passengers and freight sometimes had to be transferred from one train to another when tracks changed. The situation was inefficient and costly. It revealed an important truth about the railroad revolution. Building tracks was only the beginning. Creating an integrated transportation system required coordination, standardization, and cooperation among many different organizations. At the same time, engineers faced significant technical challenges. The United States possessed enormous geographic diversity. Railroads crossed swamps in the south, forests in the northeast, rolling farmland in the Midwest, and increasingly difficult terrain as they pushed toward the interior. Every region presented unique obstacles. Bridges had to be constructed over rivers. Cuts had to be carved through hills. Embankments had to be built across low ground. Engineers developed new techniques as experience accumulated. Mistakes were common. Some bridges failed. Some routes proved impractical. Some companies spent more money than they could afford. Yet each challenge provided lessons that improved future construction. Railroad engineering gradually became one of the country's most important professions. Meanwhile, another revolution was occurring alongside the railroad. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun earlier in Britain, was gaining momentum in the United States. Factories expanded. Manufacturing increased. Demand for transportation continued growing. The relationship between industry and railroads became mutually reinforcing. Factories needed railroads to move products. Railroads needed factories to produce rails, locomotives, tools, and equipment. Each encouraged the growth of the other. Iron production expanded partly because railroads required enormous quantities of metal. Machine shops developed new capabilities. Skilled workers became increasingly valuable. In many ways, railroads helped accelerate America's transition from a primarily agricultural society toward an industrial economy. The economic effects extended far beyond transportation itself. Before railroads, many communities remained relatively isolated. Local markets dominated daily life. Farmers often sold products close to home because transportation over long distances was difficult and expensive. Railroads changed those calculations. Suddenly, products could reach distant customers more efficiently. A farmer in the interior might sell grain to buyers hundreds of miles away. Manufacturers could distribute goods across multiple states. Regional economies became increasingly interconnected. This process helped create what economists call a national market. Instead of many separate local economies, the United States gradually developed a more unified economic system. Prices became more closely connected across regions. Trade increased. Commercial opportunities expanded. Cities benefited enormously. Places that secured railroad connections often experienced rapid growth. Businesses preferred locations with reliable transportation. Warehouses, factories, banks, and commercial enterprises frequently followed the tracks. Communities bypassed by railroads sometimes faced the opposite outcome. Some towns stagnated. Others declined. A railroad connection could influence a town's future for generations. Local leaders understood this reality. Competition for railroad routes became intense. Communities offered financial incentives. Landowners donated property. Newspapers campaigned for connections. Citizens attended public meetings to support proposed lines. The arrival of a railroad often felt like a promise of prosperity. Sometimes that promise was fulfilled. Sometimes expectations proved overly optimistic. But the belief in the transformative power of railroads became widespread throughout American society. Politics also became increasingly connected to railroad development. Government officials recognized that transportation infrastructure affected economic growth, settlement patterns, and national unity. Debates emerged regarding funding, regulation, and public support. Some Americans favored active government involvement. Others preferred private enterprise. These discussions reflected broader political disagreements about the role of government in economic development. Such debates would continue for decades. Yet despite disagreements, few people questioned the importance of transportation improvements themselves. The evidence was visible everywhere. Railroads reduced travel times. They lowered transportation costs. They expanded markets. They encouraged investment. They supported population growth. The technology was proving its value on a larger scale each year. By the late 1840s, the railroad industry had become one of the most dynamic sectors of the American economy. Track mileage continued expanding. New companies entered the business. Investors from both the United States and Europe supplied capital. Locomotives became more powerful. Construction methods improved. Public confidence increased. And then, in 1848, events on the far western edge of the continent would dramatically increase the nation's need for transportation. Gold was discovered in California. Within a short time, hundreds of thousands of people would begin moving westward. The United States suddenly faced a new challenge. How could a nation stretching from the Atlantic Ocean toward the Pacific remain connected? How could people, goods, mail, and information move efficiently across such vast distances? The railroad industry had already transformed the eastern half of the country. Now Americans would begin imagining something even more ambitious. A railroad that could cross the continent itself. An idea that seemed almost impossible. And yet, within a generation, it would become reality. In January of 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall was working near a sawmill along the American River in California when he noticed something unusual in the water. The small metallic flakes he discovered would soon change the history of the United States. Gold had been found. At first, news traveled slowly. California was distant from the major population centers of the East. Communication remained difficult. The journey from New York to California could take months, depending on the route. Yet once reports were confirmed, excitement spread rapidly. By 1849, thousands of people were leaving farms, workshops, stores, and offices in search of fortune. They became known as the 49ers, named after the year in which the Great Migration reached its peak. For the United States government, however, the gold rush represented more than a rush for wealth. It revealed the growing national problem. California had become part of the United States only recently, following the Mexican-American War. Now its population was expanding at an extraordinary rate. New settlements appeared almost overnight. San Francisco transformed from a small settlement into one of the fastest-growing cities in the world. Yet California remained separated from the eastern states by nearly 2,000 miles of mountains, deserts, plains, and wilderness. Moving people across that distance was difficult. Moving goods was expensive. Moving information was frustratingly slow. A letter sent from Washington to California might require weeks or even months to arrive. For a nation that increasingly viewed itself as a continental power, this situation was deeply concerning. The United States was growing larger, but its transportation systems had not yet caught up with its territorial expansion. The challenge became even more important because the 1840s and 1850s were years of remarkable westward movement. Thousands of settlers crossed the continent using wagon trails. Some traveled toward Oregon. Others headed for California. Many hoped to establish farms, businesses, or new lives in Western territories. The journey was long and dangerous. Travelers faced disease, accidents, harsh weather, river crossings, and shortages of supplies. Families often spent months moving across unfamiliar landscapes. Even successful journeys required enormous effort. As more Americans moved westward, political leaders began asking an increasingly urgent question. How could the nation remain united across such vast distances? This was not simply a transportation issue. It was also a political issue. The United States in the 1850s was experiencing growing tensions between North and South. Arguments over slavery, territorial expansion, and political power were becoming more intense. Each new territory raised difficult questions. Would slavery be permitted there? Would it enter the Union as a free state or a slave state? Which region would gain political influence? These debates affected nearly every major national decision, including discussions about railroads. The idea of a transcontinental railroad was becoming increasingly attractive. Many Americans believed a railroad connecting the Atlantic states to the Pacific coast would strengthen national unity, promote economic growth, and encourage settlement. The concept was simple to describe. The execution was enormously complicated. No railroad had ever crossed the North American continent. The distance alone was staggering. Builders would need to cross plains, rivers, deserts, and some of the most formidable mountain ranges on Earth. The project would require vast amounts of money, labor, materials, and political support. Before construction could begin, leaders first had to answer a fundamental question. Where should the railroad go? At first glance, the answer might seem obvious. In reality, it became one of the most contentious political debates of the era. Different regions favored different routes. Northern politicians often supported a northern route. Southern politicians preferred a southern route. Others proposed central alternatives. Each proposal promised economic benefits to certain states and territories. Each proposal threatened to leave others behind. The debate reflected the growing sectional divisions that were already shaping American politics. One influential figure in these discussions was Jefferson Davis. Years before he became President of the Confederate States during the Civil War, Davis served as Secretary of War in the United States government. He strongly supported the idea of a transcontinental railroad and ordered surveys of possible routes across the continent. Engineers, soldiers, scientists, and explorers participated in these surveys. They traveled through unfamiliar territory, mapping landscapes and gathering information. The surveys produced valuable knowledge about the American West. They documented rivers, mountain passes, vegetation, climate, and potential transportation corridors. For many Eastern Americans, these reports provided some of the first detailed descriptions of regions they had never seen. The surveys also demonstrated just how difficult the project would be. The Rocky Mountains presented enormous challenges. The Sierra Nevada mountains in California posed additional obstacles. Deserts offered limited water. Remote areas lacked infrastructure. Every possible route involved significant engineering problems. Still, support for the project continued to grow. The economic arguments were persuasive. A transcontinental railroad could dramatically reduce travel times. Mail could move faster. Trade could expand. Western resources could reach Eastern markets more efficiently. Eastern manufactured goods could reach Western communities more easily. Business leaders recognized the opportunities. So did many politicians. Yet despite widespread interest, no agreement emerged. The slavery issue continued to complicate national politics. By the late 1850s, sectional tensions dominated Washington. Compromise became increasingly difficult. The nation appeared to be moving toward crisis. As political conflict intensified, railroad development continued in the eastern states. Track mileage expanded rapidly. Cities became increasingly connected. Industrial growth accelerated. The railroad industry itself was becoming larger and more sophisticated. Companies developed more powerful locomotives. Bridges grew stronger. Engineering techniques improved. Investors continued providing capital. In many regions, railroads were already transforming everyday life. Passengers who once spent days traveling between cities could now complete journeys much more quickly. Businesses gained access to larger markets. Agricultural production expanded because farmers could ship goods farther and more profitably. The railroad was becoming an essential part of American economic life. At the same time, another technology was quietly joining the transportation revolution. That technology was the telegraph. Invented and developed during the first half of the 19th century, the telegraph allowed messages to travel almost instantly over long distances. Instead of waiting days or weeks for information, people could communicate in minutes. The railroad and the telegraph formed a remarkably effective partnership. Railroad companies used telegraph lines to coordinate train movements and improve safety. Telegraph companies often placed their wires alongside railroad rights-of-way. Together, these technologies began shrinking the practical size of the continent. Distance still existed, but it no longer felt quite as overwhelming. As the 1850s drew to a close, the United States stood at a crossroads. The dream of a transcontinental railroad remained alive. The technology existed. The economic need was obvious. Public interest was strong. Yet political divisions prevented decisive action. The nation would soon experience the greatest internal conflict in its history. A conflict that threatened to destroy the Union itself. Ironically, that conflict would also help create the political conditions necessary to build the very railroad that generations of Americans had imagined. Before the first track could cross the Great Plains toward the Pacific, the United States would have to survive the Civil War. When Abraham Lincoln became president in March of 1861, the United States was already breaking apart. Several Southern states had declared secession. Political compromise had failed. Decades of tension over slavery, economics, and the balance of power between states and the federal government had reached a point from which there was no easy return. Within weeks, the nation would be at war. The Civil War is often remembered through its battles, generals, and political consequences. Yet it was also a conflict deeply connected to transportation. In many ways, it became the first great railroad war in history. Previous wars had relied heavily on horses, wagons, and waterways. Railroads existed, but never before had they played such an important role in moving armies, weapons, supplies, and information. Both the Union and the Confederacy quickly recognized their value. For the Union, railroads offered a significant advantage. The northern states possessed a larger population, a stronger industrial base, and a more extensive railroad network. Thousands of miles of track connected major cities, manufacturing centers, ports, and agricultural regions. This infrastructure allowed the federal government to move troops and supplies with a speed that would have been impossible only a generation earlier. Soldiers could travel hundreds of miles in days rather than weeks. Food could reach armies more efficiently. Weapons and ammunition could be transported in large quantities. Railroads became essential to military logistics. Military logistics may sound like a technical subject, but it often determines the outcome of wars. Armies cannot fight effectively without food, equipment, horses, medicine, and reinforcements. The side that can supply its forces more reliably usually enjoys a major advantage. Throughout the Civil War, railroad networks helped the Union maintain that advantage. The Confederacy faced a more difficult situation. Southern railroads existed, but they were less extensive and less interconnected than those of the North. Industrial production was also more limited. Replacing damaged equipment or manufacturing new rails became increasingly difficult as the war continued. As a result, transportation challenges gradually weakened the Confederate war effort. The importance of railroads became visible in military strategy itself. Generals often targeted railroad lines, bridges, and transportation hubs. Destroying a railroad could disrupt supply chains and limit an enemy's ability to move troops. Entire campaigns were influenced by the location of rail networks. The war demonstrated something that many Americans had already suspected. Railroads were no longer simply transportation systems. They were strategic assets with enormous economic and political significance. No political leader understood this better than Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had a personal interest in railroads long before becoming president. As a lawyer in Illinois, he had worked on cases involving railroad companies. He understood the economic opportunities they created and the challenges they presented. More importantly, he recognized their importance to national development. Lincoln belonged to a generation that had witnessed the transportation revolution firsthand. He had grown up in a world dominated by rivers, roads, and animal power. During his lifetime, railroads had transformed commerce and communication across much of the country. He believed they would continue to play a central role in America's future. The Civil War created conditions that made major railroad legislation possible. Before the war, debates over slavery had complicated nearly every national issue, including the route of a transcontinental railroad. Northern and Southern politicians often disagreed sharply. Each side wanted transportation routes that would benefit its own region. As Southern states left the Union, many of those political obstacles disappeared. Congress gained the ability to move forward with projects that had previously been blocked by sectional disagreements. One of the most important outcomes was the passage of the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. This legislation became the foundation of the Transcontinental Railroad project. The law authorized the construction of a railroad connecting the existing rail network of the eastern United States with the Pacific coast. It also established a framework for financing the project. The federal government recognized that the undertaking was too large and risky to rely entirely on private investment. Building a railroad across the continent would require enormous resources. Private investors wanted opportunities, but they also wanted assurances. To encourage construction, the government offered assistance in two major forms. First, railroad companies received government bonds. A bond is essentially a loan. Investors provide money, and the borrower agrees to repay it with interest at a later date. These bonds helped companies secure funding for construction. Second, and perhaps even more significantly, the government granted large amounts of land. Railroad companies received alternating sections of public land along their routes. They could later sell much of this land to settlers, businesses, and investors. This system provided a powerful financial incentive. The more track a company built, the more land it could potentially sell. The arrangement reflected a broader vision of national development. Government leaders hoped railroads would encourage settlement, stimulate economic growth, and strengthen federal authority across Western territories. The railroad was expected to do more than move trains. It would help populate the West. It would create new communities. It would connect distant regions to national markets. It would reinforce the idea of a continental United States stretching from ocean to ocean. The Pacific Railway Act designated two primary companies to undertake the task. The Union Pacific Railroad would build westward from the Missouri River. The Central Pacific Railroad would build eastward from California. Eventually, the two lines would meet somewhere in the interior. On paper, the plan seemed straightforward. In reality, it represented one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever attempted. The Union Pacific would cross the Great Plains and eventually climb into the Rocky Mountains. The Central Pacific faced the challenge of crossing the Sierra Nevada Mountains, a range known for steep slopes, heavy snowfall, and difficult terrain. Neither company could fully predict the obstacles ahead. The continent remained vast and only partially understood. Large sections of the proposed route passed through regions where infrastructure barely existed. Construction crews would need to create roads, camps, supply systems, workshops, and communication networks almost from scratch. Labor posed another challenge. Thousands of workers would be needed. Some would come from the eastern United States. Others would be immigrants seeking economic opportunity. Still others would arrive from distant countries, bringing skills and determination that would prove essential to the project's success. The work would be dangerous. Workers would face harsh weather, difficult terrain, accidents, disease, and isolation. Many would spend years far from their families. Yet despite these challenges, preparations moved forward. Even while the Civil War continued, surveys were conducted, materials were gathered, and construction plans were refined. The nation was fighting for its survival, but it was also planning for its future. That future included a railroad stretching across the continent. Few Americans could yet imagine exactly what such a railroad would accomplish. Most focused on practical benefits such as travel, trade, and communication. Yet the consequences would reach far beyond transportation. The Transcontinental Railroad would reshape migration patterns, accelerate economic growth, influence relations with native nations, transform the Western landscape, and help create a truly national economy. It would become one of the defining achievements of 19th century America. For now, however, it remained a vision. The real test would begin when workers started laying track across some of the most challenging landscapes on the continent. And nowhere would those challenges prove greater than in the mountains and valleys of the American West, where thousands of laborers would undertake work that many people believed could never be completed. By the time the Civil War entered its final years, the dream of a transcontinental railroad had moved beyond political debate and into physical reality. Surveyors had mapped routes. Investors had committed money. Government support had been secured. Now came the most difficult part: building the railroad itself. The Pacific Railway Act had assigned the task to two companies. The Central Pacific Railroad would begin in California and build eastward. The Union Pacific Railroad would begin near the Missouri River and build westward. Where the two lines eventually met would complete one of the most ambitious transportation projects in human history. Although both companies shared the same ultimate goal, they faced very different environments. The Central Pacific confronted mountains almost immediately. The Union Pacific would first cross the vast plains of the interior before reaching the Rocky Mountains. Each company developed its own culture, leadership, and challenges. The Central Pacific was largely controlled by a group of California businessmen who would later become famous throughout the nation. Among them were Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. Together, they became known as the Big Four. None of them had originally been railroad engineers. They were entrepreneurs, investors, and businessmen who recognized the enormous opportunities that a transcontinental railroad might create. Their railroad would connect California more closely to the rest of the country. It would increase trade. It would raise land values. And if successful, it could generate tremendous wealth. The Union Pacific had its own influential leaders and investors. Like many railroad companies of the era, it relied on a combination of private capital and government assistance. Both companies understood a simple reality. The faster they built track, the more financial benefits they could potentially receive. This created a powerful incentive for rapid construction. At times, that incentive encouraged remarkable achievements. At other times, it encouraged questionable business practices. Those controversies would become important later. For now, the focus remained on construction. The work began in earnest during the 1860s. From the start, the Central Pacific faced perhaps the most intimidating obstacle on the entire route: the Sierra Nevada mountains. Even today, these mountains command respect. Their steep slopes, granite formations, and heavy winter snowfalls create difficult conditions for transportation. In the 19th century, crossing them with a railroad seemed almost impossible. Workers blasted tunnels through solid rock. They carved pathways along mountain slopes. They built bridges across deep ravines. Progress was often painfully slow. In some locations, crews advanced only a few inches per day. Explosives became essential tools. Black powder was initially used, though later crews adopted nitroglycerin in certain situations because it was more powerful. The decision increased efficiency but also increased danger. Accidents were common. The work demanded extraordinary physical endurance. Winter brought additional challenges. Heavy snow could halt progress. Blizzards isolated work camps. Avalanches threatened workers and equipment. Yet construction continued. The determination required to build through the Sierra Nevada became one of the most remarkable engineering stories of the 19th century. A crucial part of that story involved labor. At first, Central Pacific managers struggled to find enough workers. Many potential laborers were attracted to mining opportunities instead. Gold still offered the possibility of sudden wealth. Railroad construction offered difficult work for regular wages. The company eventually turned to a group that would prove indispensable: Chinese workers. Thousands of immigrants had arrived from China during and after the gold rush years. Many faced discrimination and limited economic opportunities. Railroad employment offered a chance to earn income, despite the dangers involved. Initially, some company officials doubted whether Chinese laborers could handle the demanding work. Those doubts quickly disappeared. Chinese crews demonstrated exceptional skill, discipline, and endurance. They worked long hours under extremely difficult conditions. They blasted tunnels, moved supplies, built track, and performed countless other tasks necessary for construction. Historians estimate that Chinese workers eventually constituted the majority of the Central Pacific labor force. Without their contribution, completion of the railroad would have been far more difficult and perhaps significantly delayed. For many years, their role received less recognition than it deserved. Modern historians have worked to restore greater attention to their contributions. Meanwhile, farther east, the Union Pacific faced a different set of circumstances. The Great Plains presented fewer engineering obstacles than the Sierra Nevada, but they introduced challenges of their own. Distances were enormous. Supplies had to be transported across long stretches of territory. Temporary construction camps moved continually as track advanced westward. Entire mobile communities emerged around the railroad. Workers, merchants, cooks, blacksmiths, surveyors, and laborers followed the construction effort. Some settlements appeared almost overnight. A few disappeared just as quickly once the railroad moved onward. Life in these camps could be rough. Conditions were often primitive. Housing was temporary. Work schedules were demanding. Yet thousands of people participated because the railroad represented employment and opportunity. Construction crews developed an impressive system for laying track. Teams performed specialized tasks. Some prepared the ground. Others positioned ties. Others laid rails. Still others secured the track in place. When operations ran smoothly, remarkable amounts of track could be completed in a single day. Speed became a source of pride. It also reflected the intense competition between the two railroad companies. The government compensated construction partly based on mileage completed. As a result, both companies had financial incentives to build rapidly. This competition sometimes produced extraordinary achievements. It also encouraged duplication of effort and occasional inefficiencies. The race toward the center of the continent became one of the most closely followed stories in America. Newspapers reported progress. Investors monitored developments. Politicians paid attention. Ordinary citizens followed the project with fascination. The railroad symbolized something larger than transportation. It symbolized national ambition. Only a few years earlier, the country had been torn apart by civil war. Now Americans were attempting to physically unite the continent. The symbolism was powerful. At the same time, the railroad's advance had profound consequences for Native American nations living throughout the West. For generations, many indigenous communities had maintained complex societies across the plains, mountains, deserts, and river valleys. The arrival of surveyors, construction crews, settlers, and military forces altered these landscapes dramatically. Railroad expansion accelerated changes that were already underway. Traditional patterns of life faced increasing pressure. Conflicts became more frequent. Federal policies increasingly favored settlement and economic development. The railroad would play a major role in reshaping the relationship between the United States government and native nations. Those consequences would continue long after the final spike was driven into the tracks. For now, however, construction remained the immediate focus. Year after year, the rails pushed farther across the continent. Mountains were crossed. Bridges were completed. Miles accumulated. What had once seemed impossible was gradually becoming reality. The question was no longer whether the railroad could be built. The question was how soon the two advancing lines would finally meet. And as that meeting point drew closer, the entire nation watched with anticipation, aware that a historic moment was approaching. By the spring of 1869, the two great railroad companies were approaching one another across the interior of North America. For years, workers had blasted tunnels through mountains, crossed rivers, endured harsh winters, and laid thousands of miles of track. Now the end was finally in sight. The Union Pacific had pushed westward from the Missouri River. The Central Pacific had advanced eastward from California. Only a short distance remained between them. As completion approached, excitement spread throughout the country. Newspapers reported every major development. Politicians celebrated the project as a national achievement. Business leaders anticipated new commercial opportunities. Ordinary citizens followed the progress with fascination. Many understood that something historic was about to happen. For most of human history, crossing the North American continent had been an immense undertaking. Travelers moved by foot, horseback, wagon, or ship. Journeys required weeks, months, or even longer. The completion of a transcontinental railroad would fundamentally change those realities. The final meeting place was selected near Promontory Summit in what is now Utah. The location was remote, but its significance would soon make it famous. Construction crews on both sides worked rapidly to finish the remaining sections of track. Competition remained intense until the very end. For years, both companies had benefited financially from every additional mile of railroad they completed. This incentive had encouraged rapid construction and occasional disputes regarding routes and territory. Government officials eventually intervened to establish the final meeting point. With that decision made, preparations began for a ceremonial conclusion. The event would become known as the driving of the Golden Spike. The spike itself was largely symbolic. Ordinary railroad spikes were made of iron. This special spike was crafted from gold and intended to commemorate the completion of the line. Its purpose was not practical. Its purpose was ceremonial. It represented the joining of East and West through a continuous railroad connection. On May 10, 1869, representatives of both companies gathered at Promontory Summit. Railroad executives, government officials, workers, journalists, and invited guests assembled to witness the occasion. Telegraph operators prepared to send news of the event across the country. This detail is worth remembering. The railroad and the telegraph had grown together throughout much of the 19th century. Now they would share one of their most memorable moments. As preparations were completed, the ceremony began. Several commemorative spikes were presented. Speeches were delivered. Photographs were taken. Then came the symbolic act itself. A final spike would be driven into the railroad. Accounts differ regarding some details of the ceremony, but the broader significance was unmistakable. The railroad was complete. For the first time in history, a continuous rail connection linked the Atlantic transportation network with the Pacific coast. When the final blows were struck, telegraph operators immediately transmitted the news. Across the nation, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered. Cannons fired in some cities. People who would never see the railroad in person nevertheless recognized its importance. The United States had accomplished something extraordinary. Yet the significance of the event extended far beyond symbolism. The railroad produced immediate practical effects. Travel times changed dramatically. Before the railroad, crossing the continent could require months. Travelers faced difficult terrain, uncertain weather, disease, accidents, and countless other challenges. After the railroad, the journey could be completed in a matter of days. The difference was revolutionary. Distance itself seemed to shrink. A person could leave the eastern United States and arrive in California faster than previous generations would have believed possible. Mail moved more quickly. Newspapers traveled farther. Business transactions accelerated. Families separated by great distances found communication easier. Economic consequences followed rapidly. The railroad created new opportunities for trade. Western agricultural products could reach Eastern markets more efficiently. Eastern manufactured goods could be transported westward at lower cost. Commercial networks expanded. Investments increased. Entrepreneurs identified new possibilities almost immediately. The railroad also strengthened the position of cities connected to the network. Certain locations became transportation hubs where goods were transferred, stored, processed, or redistributed. These hubs attracted businesses, workers, and investment. Over time, some would grow into major urban centers. Chicago provides one of the most important examples. Although already growing before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chicago's strategic location within the expanding rail network helped transform it into one of the nation's most important cities. Railroads connected Chicago to agricultural regions, industrial centers, and distant markets. The city became a crossroads of American commerce. Many other communities experienced similar, though smaller, transformations. The railroad altered patterns of settlement as well. Land that had once seemed remote became more accessible. Farmers could transport crops more easily. Businesses could receive supplies more reliably. Settlers often preferred locations near railroad lines because transportation influenced economic opportunity. As a result, railroads helped shape the geography of development throughout the American West. Not all consequences were positive. The railroad accelerated pressures on Native American nations whose lands lay along expanding transportation corridors. Increased migration, settlement, commercial activity, and military presence altered existing ways of life. Conflicts intensified. Federal policies increasingly favored expansion and development. The railroad became one of the most powerful tools through which those changes occurred. Its benefits and costs were not distributed equally. The completion of the railroad also encouraged a new vision of national identity. Americans increasingly thought of the country as a connected continental nation rather than a collection of distant regions. A traveler could now move from one side of the country to the other using a single transportation system. The psychological effect was significant. The continent seemed smaller. The Union appeared stronger. National markets became more practical. National communication became more efficient. Yet, even as celebrations continued, another story was beginning. Building the railroad had required enormous sums of money. Investors expected profits. Executives sought expansion. Competition remained fierce. The completion of the Transcontinental Line did not mark the end of railroad history. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a much larger transformation. During the decades that followed, railroad companies would expand across the continent. Track mileage would multiply. Corporate fortunes would rise. Financial empires would emerge. New technologies would reshape transportation. Entire industries would develop around the railroad network. By the late 19th century, railroads would become some of the most powerful businesses in the world. And a handful of ambitious men would accumulate wealth and influence on a scale that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. The age of railroad expansion was only beginning. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 was not the end of the railroad story. In many ways, it was the beginning of something even larger. The decades that followed witnessed one of the greatest economic transformations in American history. Thousands of additional miles of track would be laid. new railroad companies would emerge. Existing companies would expand. Fortunes would be made and lost. And the railroad industry would help create a new kind of America, in America dominated by large corporations, national markets, and immense concentrations of wealth. To understand this transformation, it is important to remember that railroads were unlike most businesses that had existed before them. A small store could be opened by a local merchant. A farm could be operated by a family. A workshop might require only a few employees. A railroad was different. Building and operating a railroad required enormous amounts of money. Tracks had to be constructed. Bridges had to be maintained. Locomotives had to be purchased. Stations, warehouses, workshops, and telegraph systems all required investment. No single individual could easily finance such enterprises alone. As a result, railroads became pioneers in large-scale corporate organization. Thousands of investors often owned shares in a single railroad company. Managers supervised vast operations spread across multiple states. Complex administrative systems developed to coordinate activities across great distances. Many practices that later became common in modern corporations first appeared within railroad companies. In a sense, the railroad industry became a training ground for modern business management. The financial center of this new world was increasingly located in New York City. During the 19th century, Wall Street was evolving into the heart of American finance. Investors bought and sold stocks and bonds. Banks provided capital. Railroad companies raised money for expansion. The connection between railroads and finance became so strong that railroad stocks often dominated investment markets. Many Americans who never saw a locomotive still felt the influence of the railroad industry through investments, banking, and economic activity. As railroad construction accelerated, a new class of powerful business leaders emerged. Some became admired as builders and innovators. Others became controversial figures accused of greed and manipulation. Often, the same individual inspired both opinions. One of the most influential railroad figures was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt had begun his career in transportation long before railroads dominated the economy. He first built wealth through shipping and steamboats. Over time, however, he recognized that railroads represented the future. Rather than resisting change, he embraced it. During the mid-19th century, Vanderbilt acquired control of several important rail lines and combined them into larger systems. His efforts helped improve efficiency and strengthen connections between major cities. Particularly important was his role in developing rail connections centered on New York. Vanderbilt understood that transportation networks became more valuable when they worked together rather than separately. His approach reflected a broader trend occurring throughout the industry. Small lines increasingly gave way to larger systems. Consolidation became common. Railroads sought economies of scale. The phrase economies of scale refers to cost advantages that occur when operations become larger. A large railroad could often move freight more efficiently than a smaller competitor. It could purchase supplies in greater quantities. It could spread costs across larger networks. These advantages encouraged expansion. Another famous figure was Jay Gould. Unlike Vanderbilt, Gould remains one of the most controversial businessmen in American history. He possessed remarkable financial skill and a deep understanding of markets. At the same time, critics accused him of speculation, manipulation, and questionable business practices. Gould became involved with numerous railroad ventures during the late 19th century. His activities reflected the intense competition that characterized the industry. Railroad companies frequently battled for territory, customers, and investment capital. These conflicts sometimes produced innovation. At other times, they produced financial instability. The railroad industry became known for dramatic booms and busts. periods of optimism encouraged rapid expansion. Investors poured money into new projects. Track mileage increased. Then economic downturns would expose weaknesses. Some companies failed. Others reorganized. Investors suffered losses. The cycle repeated itself more than once. Despite these fluctuations, the overall trend remained clear. Railroads continued expanding across the nation. By the 1880s, the network had grown to astonishing proportions. Lines connected major cities, agricultural regions, mining districts, ports, and industrial centers. The railroad had become the circulatory system of the American economy. Coal moved by rail. Steel moved by rail. Lumber moved by rail. Livestock moved by rail. Grain moved by rail. Manufactured goods moved by rail. Almost every major industry depended upon railroad transportation. This dependence gave railroad companies considerable power. They often determined shipping rates. They influenced the location of businesses. They affected land values. Communities frequently competed for railroad connections because economic opportunities followed the tracks. Yet power brought scrutiny. Farmers, merchants, and consumers sometimes complained about railroad practices. One common concern involved freight rates. Railroads often charged different customers different prices. Large shippers might receive favorable terms. Smaller customers sometimes paid more. The complexity of railroad pricing created confusion and frustration. Many people believed the system was unfair. These concerns became especially important in agricultural regions. Farmers depended heavily on railroads to transport crops to market. When shipping costs increased, profits declined. As a result, railroad policies became a major political issue. Organizations representing farmers began demanding reform. Public debates intensified. Questions emerged about whether private companies should possess so much influence over essential transportation infrastructure. These debates marked an important turning point in American history. The nation was beginning to grapple with issues that remain familiar today. How much power should large corporations possess? What role should government play in regulating business? How can economic growth be encouraged while protecting the public interest? Railroads forced Americans to confront such questions earlier and more dramatically than many other industries. Meanwhile, railroad companies themselves continued growing more sophisticated. They adopted new accounting systems. They improved scheduling. They expanded telegraph networks. Managers developed methods for coordinating thousands of employees across vast territories. The scale of operations would have amazed earlier generations. A single railroad company might employ more people than some towns contained. It might own thousands of miles of track and operate across multiple states. The organizational challenges were immense. Yet these challenges also produced innovation. Many techniques later used by large corporations in manufacturing, retail, finance, and communication were first refined by railroad managers. The influence of railroads therefore extended beyond transportation. They helped shape the structure of modern business itself. By the end of the 19th century, the railroad industry had become one of the most important forces in American life. Its leaders were among the nation's most powerful individuals. Its companies influenced markets, politics, and settlement patterns. Its financial needs transformed Wall Street. Its management practices helped create corporate America. And despite all this growth, the railroad revolution was still producing new changes. Perhaps the most surprising of those changes involved something so ordinary that most people rarely think about it today: time itself. Because as trains moved faster and farther across the country, Americans discovered that even the clock would need to change. By the late 19th century, millions of Americans depended on railroads in ways their grandparents could scarcely have imagined. Trains carried passengers across states and territories. They transported mail, newspapers, livestock, coal, lumber, steel, grain, and countless other products. Railroad schedules influenced business decisions, travel plans, and daily routines. Yet as the network expanded, a surprising problem emerged. The problem was time. Today, most people rarely think about how time is organized. Clocks in the same time zone generally display the same hour. Schedules can be coordinated across vast distances. A traveler can move from city to city knowing that local time follows a predictable system. Before the railroad age, however, things worked very differently. For centuries, communities typically used local solar time. When the sun reached its highest point in the sky, it was considered noon. This approach worked reasonably well in a world where most people lived and traveled locally. A few minutes of difference between towns rarely mattered. If one town's clock differed slightly from another's, the consequences were usually insignificant. Railroads changed that reality. As trains began moving rapidly across long distances, scheduling became increasingly complicated. A train departing one city might travel through multiple communities, each using its own local time. Differences of only a few minutes could create confusion. Confusion could create delays. And delays could create danger. Safe railroad operations required precision. Dispatchers needed accurate information. Engineers needed reliable schedules. Passengers expected consistency. The growing complexity of the railroad network made the old system increasingly impractical. In some regions, railroad companies developed their own time standards. Different railroads sometimes used different clocks. The result was a patchwork of competing systems that could be difficult to manage. Timetables became complicated. Coordination became challenging. As traffic increased, the need for a better solution became obvious. Railroad executives eventually recognized that standardization was essential. After years of discussion and planning, a major change occurred in 1883. Railroad companies across much of North America adopted a system of standardized time zones. The continent was divided into broad regions. Communities within each region would generally observe the same time. The arrangement simplified scheduling and improved coordination. Although governments would later formalize these practices, it was the railroads that initially drove the change. In a very real sense, railroads helped create the modern concept of time zones. This achievement may seem less dramatic than building a transcontinental railroad, yet its impact was profound. Everyday life became more predictable. Businesses could coordinate activities more effectively. Communication improved. Transportation became safer and more efficient. Millions of people gradually adapted to a new way of measuring time. The railroad had not merely connected cities. It had helped synchronize the nation itself. Time was only one example of a broader trend. Railroads encouraged standardization in many areas. Track gauges became increasingly uniform. Operating procedures became more consistent. Business practices evolved. The demands of large-scale transportation encouraged systems that could function across vast distances. Another technology played a crucial role in this process: the telegraph. Although often remembered separately, the telegraph and railroad developed a remarkably close partnership. Railroad companies needed fast communication. Telegraph companies needed routes where lines could be installed and maintained. The two technologies complemented one another perfectly. Telegraph wires frequently followed railroad rights-of-way. Messages traveled almost instantly while trains carried people and goods. Together, they transformed the speed of information. Before the telegraph, news often traveled no faster than the fastest available transportation. A letter required physical delivery. A report required a messenger. Information moved at the speed of travel. The telegraph changed that relationship. Messages could now cross great distances within minutes. Railroads quickly incorporated this capability into daily operations. Dispatchers communicated with stations. Schedules could be adjusted. Accidents could sometimes be prevented. The combination of rail transportation and electronic communication represented one of the most important technological partnerships of the 19th century. Its influence extended beyond railroad management. Businesses used telegraph networks to coordinate transactions. Newspapers received information more quickly. Financial markets reacted faster to events occurring hundreds or thousands of miles away. The nation became increasingly interconnected. Railroads also transformed the movement of mail. The United States Postal Service had existed since the nation's early years, but railroads dramatically improved its efficiency. Railway mail service cars became an important innovation. Inside specially designed railroad cars, postal workers sorted mail while trains were moving. Instead of waiting until arrival, processing occurred during transit. This saved valuable time. Letters, documents, newspapers, and packages reached destinations more quickly. The pace of communication accelerated. Families separated by distance found it easier to remain in contact. Businesses could exchange information more efficiently. Government agencies improved coordination. Railroads helped shrink the practical size of the country. The effects were visible in everyday travel as well. Early rail journeys could be uncomfortable. Passenger cars often lacked many conveniences. Long trips required patience. Over time, however, railroad companies sought ways to attract customers. Competition encouraged improvement. One important development was the sleeping car. Perhaps the most famous examples were associated with George Pullman. Pullman's company designed railroad cars intended to make overnight travel more comfortable. Passengers could sleep in berths rather than remaining seated throughout long journeys. The innovation changed expectations. Travel became more appealing. Long-distance trips became less exhausting. For many Americans, railroad travel began to feel modern, sophisticated, and convenient. Dining cars represented another improvement. Passengers could enjoy meals while traveling. Instead of stopping for lengthy breaks, services could be provided directly on the train. These innovations may seem ordinary today, but they represented significant advances in comfort and efficiency. Railroads were no longer merely transportation systems. They were becoming complete travel experiences. Luxury trains emerged on some routes. Well-appointed cars, attentive service, and elegant accommodations attracted wealthier travelers. At the same time, more affordable services expanded access for ordinary passengers. The railroad connected social classes, regions, and communities in new ways. People traveled farther than previous generations. Ideas spread more rapidly. Cultural exchange increased. The influence of railroads could even be seen in language and habits. Terms related to schedules, timetables, and standardized operations became part of everyday life. Punctuality acquired new importance. When transportation depended on precise schedules, arriving late carried greater consequences. The railroad age encouraged a culture increasingly organized around clocks and coordination. By the end of the 19th century, many Americans lived according to systems that railroads had helped create. They checked standardized time, received mail transported by train, read newspapers delivered through railroad networks, purchased goods shipped over rail lines, traveled using schedules that would have seemed astonishing to earlier generations. Yet the railroad's influence extended even further. Beyond communication and daily life, it was helping transform agriculture, industry, and the very structure of the national economy. The tracks that crossed the continent were not merely carrying trains. They were carrying the products, resources, and opportunities that would fuel America's rise as an industrial power. As the 19th century moved toward its final decades, the railroad had become far more than a transportation system. It was now one of the central foundations of the American economy. The tracks stretching across the continent connected farms to cities, mines to factories, forests to construction sites, and ports to inland markets. Almost every major industry depended upon the railroad in some way. To understand how deeply railroads transformed America, it helps to begin with agriculture. For much of human history, farmers were limited by geography. A community could generally consume only so much food. If a farmer produced more than local buyers needed, selling the surplus became difficult. Transportation costs often made long-distance trade impractical. Railroads changed that calculation. Farmers could now ship crops hundreds or even thousands of miles. Wheat grown on the Great Plains could reach eastern cities. Livestock raised in western regions could be transported to major processing centers. Agricultural production expanded because access to distant markets became more reliable. Land that had once seemed too remote for large-scale farming suddenly became valuable. The railroad encouraged settlement. Settlement increased production. Production generated additional railroad traffic. The cycle reinforced itself. Nowhere was this relationship more visible than in the American Midwest. The fertile lands of states such as Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Minnesota became some of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. Railroads allowed those regions to participate fully in national and international markets. The effects were not limited to farming. The cattle industry also experienced dramatic changes. Before railroads reached much of the West, transporting large numbers of cattle to market was difficult. Long cattle drives became one solution. Cowboys moved herds across great distances toward railroad towns where animals could be loaded onto trains. From there, cattle could be transported to slaughterhouses and urban markets. This connection between railroads and cattle helped shape one of the most famous chapters of Western history. The image of cowboys driving cattle across open plains is deeply associated with the American West. Yet those drives were closely linked to the railroad network. Without railroads, many cattle operations would have faced severe limitations. The railroad provided access to customers far beyond local regions. Agriculture was only one part of a larger economic transformation. Industrial growth accelerated as well. Factories required raw materials. Coal-powered machinery. Iron and steel formed the backbone of industrial construction. Railroads moved these resources efficiently across vast distances. The relationship between industry and railroads was mutually beneficial. Factories produced rails, locomotives, tools, and equipment. Railroads transported industrial products to customers. Each sector encouraged the growth of the other. One city illustrates this relationship better than perhaps any other: Chicago. In the early 19th century, Chicago was a relatively small settlement near the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan. Its location was advantageous, but its future was far from certain. The arrival of railroads changed everything. Chicago occupied a strategic position between eastern markets and the expanding interior. Rail lines converged there from multiple directions. Agricultural products arrived from surrounding regions. Manufactured goods arrived from eastern factories. Merchants, investors, and entrepreneurs recognized the opportunities. The city grew rapidly. Warehouses multiplied. Rail yards expanded. Banks opened. Businesses established headquarters. Immigrants arrived seeking employment. By the late 19th century, Chicago had become one of the most important transportation and commercial centers in the world. The city served as a gateway connecting different parts of the American economy. Grain offers a useful example. Farmers throughout the Midwest shipped enormous quantities of grain by rail. Chicago became a major center for storage, trading, and distribution. Innovations such as grain elevators improved efficiency. Markets became more organized. Prices reflected conditions across broader regions rather than only local circumstances. The result was a more integrated national economy. Railroads also encouraged the growth of new technologies. One particularly important innovation was the refrigerated rail car. Before refrigeration, transporting perishable products over long distances was difficult. Meat, dairy products, fruits, and vegetables often spoiled before reaching distant customers. Refrigerated rail cars changed that situation. Using ice and insulated designs, these cars helped preserve products during transport. The impact was substantial. Food could travel farther. Markets expanded. Consumers gained access to products that would previously have been unavailable. Industries adapted accordingly. Meatpacking companies, in particular, benefited from refrigerated transportation. Chicago again became a major center of activity. The city's stockyards and processing facilities grew into enormous enterprises. Railroads brought livestock in and carried processed products out. The system linked farms, ranches, factories, wholesalers, retailers, and consumers across the country. Economic integration accelerated. Another consequence involved mining. Coal was the dominant fuel of the industrial age. Factories used it. Railroads used it. Homes and businesses used it. Moving large quantities of coal required efficient transportation. Railroads provided exactly that. Mining regions gained access to broader markets. Production increased. Industrial growth received additional support. The same pattern occurred with iron ore, timber, and many other resources. Railroads enabled large-scale extraction and distribution. Natural resources that had once remained relatively isolated became part of national and international commerce. The economic effects were enormous. By the late 19th century, the United States was becoming one of the world's leading industrial powers. Numerous factors contributed to that rise. Abundant natural resources played a role. Immigration provided labor. Technological innovation encouraged productivity. Yet railroads connected all of these elements together. Without transportation, resources remain trapped where they are found. Without transportation, factories struggle to obtain materials. Without transportation, products cannot easily reach customers. Railroads solved these problems on a scale never before seen in North America. The growth they encouraged was impressive, but it also produced new challenges. Large corporations accumulated significant power. Economic inequality became more visible. Workers often faced difficult conditions. Competition could be intense. Periods of prosperity were sometimes followed by economic downturns. The railroad industry itself became a source of both opportunity and controversy. Millions of Americans benefited from expanding markets and increased mobility. At the same time, many questioned whether the economic system was distributing its rewards fairly. Farmers complained about freight rates. Workers demanded better treatment. Political reformers called for greater oversight. The railroad had helped create a modern economy. Now Americans had to decide how that economy should be governed. As the nation entered the final decades of the 19th century, those questions became increasingly difficult to ignore. The next great chapter of railroad history would not focus primarily on tracks, locomotives, or engineering. It would focus on people. On workers, unions, strikes, and conflicts over the future of industrial America. Because the same railroad system that created vast fortunes also depended upon hundreds of thousands of men and women whose labor kept the trains moving every day. By the 1870s, railroads had become one of the largest employers in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people depended on the industry for their livelihoods. Some worked aboard trains. Others repaired locomotives. Many maintained tracks, operated telegraph systems, loaded freight, managed stations, or performed countless other tasks necessary to keep the network functioning. To passengers watching a train arrive at a station, the process might have appeared smooth and effortless. In reality, every journey depended upon an enormous workforce. The railroad was one of the most complex organizations that had ever existed in North America. Keeping it operating required discipline, coordination, and labor on a massive scale. Life as a railroad worker could be demanding. Engineers spent long hours operating powerful locomotives. Firemen shoveled coal into furnaces to maintain steam pressure. Brakemen performed dangerous work moving between rail cars, often in poor weather and under hazardous conditions. Track crews labored outdoors through heat, cold, rain, and snow. Accidents were common. The railroad industry brought opportunity, but it also brought risk. In the 19th century, workplace safety standards were often far less developed than they are today. Many jobs involved physical danger. Heavy machinery, moving trains, mechanical failures, and human error could all lead to injury or death. Despite these risks, railroad employment attracted workers from many backgrounds. Immigrants found opportunities in the industry. Rural laborers sought higher wages. Skilled mechanics and engineers built careers around the rapidly growing transportation system. Railroads became an important part of the nation's labor force. As the industry expanded, another challenge emerged. The interests of railroad owners and railroad workers did not always align. Company executives focused on profits, efficiency, expansion, and competition. Workers often focused on wages, working conditions, job security, and safety. During periods of economic growth, these tensions could remain manageable. During economic downturns, however, conflicts frequently intensified. The late 19th century experienced several major financial crises. One of the most significant occurred in 1873. Known as the Panic of 1873, the crisis triggered a severe economic depression that affected businesses throughout the country. Railroad companies were heavily involved. Years of rapid expansion had encouraged speculation and borrowing. Some projects proved profitable. Others did not. When financial conditions deteriorated, many railroad companies faced serious difficulties. Construction slowed. Investments declined. Businesses failed. Unemployment increased. In response to financial pressures, some railroad companies reduced wages. Workers who were already facing economic hardship suddenly found themselves earning less money. Frustration grew. The situation eventually led to one of the most important labor conflicts in American history. In 1877, railroad workers across several states launched protests and strikes. What began as a dispute over wage reductions quickly expanded. The unrest spread through major railroad centers and industrial communities. The event became known as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It was the first nationwide labor uprising in American history. The strike revealed how important railroads had become. When trains stopped moving, economic activity slowed. Transportation networks were disrupted. Businesses felt the effects. Government officials became concerned. In several cities, tensions escalated into violence. Property was damaged. Clashes occurred between workers and authorities. State militias were deployed. Eventually, federal troops became involved. The strike was suppressed, and railroad operations resumed. Yet the significance of the event extended far beyond its immediate outcome. The strike demonstrated that industrial America faced new social challenges. Large corporations possessed unprecedented economic power. Large workforces possessed the ability to organize collective action. The relationship between labor, business, and government was becoming increasingly complex. Many Americans began paying closer attention to labor issues. The decades that followed witnessed the growth of labor organizations seeking to improve working conditions and wages. Railroad workers played an important role in these developments. The industry's size and visibility made it a focal point for debates about workers' rights. At the same time, railroad companies continued refining their operations. Technology improved. Management systems became more sophisticated. Equipment became more reliable. Yet efficiency often came with pressure. Workers were expected to maintain demanding schedules. Railroad competition remained intense. Executives sought ways to reduce costs and increase productivity. Conflicts occasionally resurfaced. One of the most famous examples involved the Pullman Company. George Pullman had become well known for developing sleeping cars that improved passenger comfort during long-distance travel. His company eventually grew into a major enterprise. Pullman also created a company town near Chicago. The community was intended to provide housing and services for workers. At first glance, the arrangement appeared progressive. The town featured planned streets, utilities, and amenities that many industrial workers elsewhere lacked. Yet the system also gave the company substantial control over daily life. Workers rented homes owned by the company. Many aspects of community life remained tied to their employer. When economic difficulties emerged during the 1890s, tensions increased. The Panic of 1893 triggered another major economic downturn. Businesses struggled. Unemployment rose. Railroad traffic declined. Many companies sought to reduce expenses. At Pullman, wages were cut. However, housing costs and other expenses associated with company-owned facilities remained largely unchanged. Workers grew increasingly dissatisfied. In 1894, employees launched a strike. The dispute soon expanded beyond the Pullman Company itself. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, supported the workers. Railroad employees in multiple regions participated in a boycott involving trains that carried Pullman cars. The conflict disrupted transportation across significant portions of the country. Again, the importance of railroads became obvious. When railroad operations were interrupted, the effects spread far beyond the industry itself. Mail delivery suffered. Commerce slowed. Government officials faced pressure to restore service. Federal authorities eventually intervened. Court orders were issued. Troops were deployed. The strike was ultimately defeated. Yet, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Pullman strike left a lasting legacy. It raised questions about economic power. It highlighted concerns regarding labor conditions. It encouraged public discussion about the relationship between workers, corporations, and government institutions. These debates would continue well into the 20th century. Railroad workers were not merely operating trains. They were helping shape the broader history of labor relations in the United States. Their experiences influenced public policy, union organization, and political movements. Meanwhile, the railroad network itself continued expanding. Track mileage increased. Technology improved. Passenger travel became more comfortable. Freight operations became more efficient. The industry remained central to American life. Yet another transformation was unfolding across the Great Plains and Western Territories. The railroad was changing not only cities and factories, but entire landscapes. It was altering migration patterns. It was reshaping relationships between settlers and native nations. And it was helping create a new vision of the American West, one connected by steel rails rather than separated by vast distances. The consequences of that transformation would be felt for generations. When many Americans think about the railroad and the American West, they often imagine progress, expansion, and opportunity. For millions of settlers, investors, merchants, and political leaders, the railroad represented exactly those things. It connected distant regions. It encouraged migration. It stimulated trade. It opened new economic possibilities. Yet the same railroad that created opportunity for some brought profound disruption to others. Few groups experienced that disruption more deeply than the native nations of the American West. Long before the arrival of railroad surveyors, construction crews, and settlers, the Great Plains, mountain valleys, deserts, and river systems of North America were home to diverse indigenous societies. These nations possessed their own histories, political structures, economies, cultures, and relationships with the land. The West was not an empty wilderness waiting to be occupied. It was already inhabited. The railroad entered a landscape that was both populated and contested. To understand the railroad's impact, it is important to remember that transportation and settlement were closely connected. Railroads made migration easier. Migration increased population. Growing populations created demand for land, resources, towns, farms, and businesses. As railroad lines expanded, waves of newcomers often followed. Land that had once been difficult for settlers to reach became more accessible. Railroad companies actively encouraged this process. Many companies possessed large land grants provided by the federal government. Selling land became an important source of revenue. Advertisements promoted opportunities in Western territories. Pamphlets described fertile farmland, economic prospects, and the promise of a new beginning. Immigrants arriving from Europe frequently encountered these promotional campaigns. Families from eastern states encountered them as well. The railroad was not merely transporting people. It was helping direct where people would live. As settlement increased, pressure on native lands intensified. Treaties were negotiated, revised, disputed, and often broken. Federal policies increasingly favored expansion and development. Military forts appeared along transportation corridors. Government authority expanded into regions that had previously experienced less direct federal control. The process was complex and often deeply controversial. Different native nations responded in different ways. Some sought accommodation. Some pursued diplomacy. Others resisted. No single experience represented all indigenous communities. Yet throughout much of the West, railroad expansion became closely associated with broader changes that threatened traditional ways of life. One of the most dramatic examples involved the buffalo. For many native nations of the Great Plains, buffalo played a central role in economic, cultural, and social life. The animals provided food, clothing, shelter materials, tools, and numerous other necessities. Large buffalo herds once moved across vast portions of the plains. Their numbers were immense. Travelers often described herds stretching beyond the horizon. The arrival of railroads altered this environment in several ways. Trains made it easier for hunters to reach buffalo ranges. Commercial markets for buffalo hides expanded. Transportation networks allowed products to be shipped efficiently. Hunting increased dramatically. At the same time, expanding settlement reduced available habitat. Over time, buffalo populations declined at a catastrophic rate. By the late 19th century, the great herds that had once defined the plains had largely disappeared. The consequences were profound. Environmental systems changed. Economic patterns shifted. Many native communities faced enormous hardship as a result. The decline of the buffalo cannot be attributed solely to railroads, but railroads played an important role in the broader transformation. The railroad also changed military logistics. Federal forces could move troops and supplies more efficiently across long distances. This capability influenced conflicts between the United States government and various native nations during the late 19th century. Military campaigns that once required extended preparation became easier to support. Transportation advantages strengthened federal authority throughout the West. At the same time, railroad towns began appearing across the landscape. Some existed primarily because a railroad line passed through a particular location. A water stop became a settlement. A supply depot became a community. A junction became a town. Not every railroad town survived. Some prospered. Others declined. A few disappeared almost entirely after economic conditions changed. Yet collectively, these communities helped reshape the geography of the American West. The railroad influenced where people lived, worked, traded, and traveled. The pattern can still be seen today. Many modern cities owe part of their development to decisions made by railroad companies more than a century ago. The railroad also encouraged new forms of tourism. Regions that had once been difficult to reach became more accessible. Travelers visited mountains, forests, deserts, and scenic landscapes. Businesses developed hotels, resorts, and related services. The concept of long-distance leisure travel expanded. For some Americans, the West became a destination rather than a distant frontier. Railroads promoted this image through advertisements, guidebooks, and promotional campaigns. These efforts helped shape popular perceptions of Western landscapes. Meanwhile, scientific exploration increased. Researchers, surveyors, geologists, and naturalists gained improved access to remote regions. Knowledge of the continent expanded. Maps became more accurate. Resources were documented. Economic opportunities were identified. Railroads contributed to this growing understanding of the American landscape. The transformation of the West therefore involved many interconnected processes: migration, settlement, commerce, environmental change, military expansion, tourism, scientific exploration. The railroad touched all of them. Its influence extended far beyond transportation alone. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the image of the West had changed dramatically from what earlier generations had known. Many areas once considered remote were now linked to national markets. Goods traveled quickly. Information traveled quickly. People traveled quickly. The distances that had shaped life for centuries seemed smaller than before. At the same time, the changes brought difficult questions. Who benefited from expansion? Who bore its costs? How should economic development be balanced against cultural preservation, environmental concerns, and competing claims to land? Americans debated these issues then, and many remain subjects of discussion today. What is certain is that the railroad played a central role in creating the modern West. Its tracks carried settlers, soldiers, merchants, tourists, and immigrants. Its stations became gathering places. Its towns became cities. Its economic influence reached nearly every corner of the region. And by the turn of the 20th century, the railroad had become so deeply woven into American life that many people could hardly imagine the nation without it. Yet another technological revolution was approaching. One that would eventually challenge the railroad's dominance. A revolution powered not by steam and steel rails, but by roads, engines, gasoline, and a new vision of personal mobility. As the 19th century came to an end and the 20th century began, the railroad stood at the height of its influence. Its tracks stretched across the continent. Its companies moved vast quantities of freight. Its stations connected cities, towns, farms, and industrial centers. Its schedules helped organize daily life. For many Americans, the railroad seemed permanent. It was difficult to imagine a future in which trains would not dominate long-distance transportation. In many respects, this period represented the golden age of rail travel. Passenger trains became faster, safer, and more comfortable than ever before. Railroad companies competed aggressively for customers. To attract travelers, they invested in improved equipment and higher levels of service. The experience of long-distance travel changed dramatically. A journey that had once required weeks in a wagon could now be completed in comparative comfort. Sleeping cars became increasingly sophisticated. Dining cars offered meals prepared while the train moved across the countryside. Observation cars allowed passengers to enjoy changing landscapes through large windows. For some travelers, a railroad journey became an experience in itself rather than merely a means of reaching a destination. Luxury trains gained particular attention. Certain services became famous for elegant accommodations and attentive service. Wealthy passengers could travel in remarkable comfort. At the same time, more affordable options allowed ordinary Americans to participate in the growing transportation network. The railroad connected social classes as well as geographic regions. Cities benefited from this increased mobility. Business travelers moved between commercial centers. Families visited relatives more easily. Tourists explored distant destinations. Students attended schools farther from home. The movement of people accelerated. The movement of ideas accelerated as well. Cultural influences spread more rapidly when transportation became easier. Newspapers reached wider audiences. Magazines circulated nationally. Popular trends moved between regions. The railroad contributed to the emergence of a more interconnected national culture. Railroads remained equally important to freight transportation. Factories depended upon reliable deliveries. Retail businesses relied on railroad shipments. Agricultural producers continued using trains to reach markets. Coal, steel, lumber, grain, livestock, and manufactured goods flowed through an increasingly complex network. By the early 20th century, railroads had become essential infrastructure. Many industries could not function efficiently without them. The scale of operations was extraordinary. Some railroad companies operated thousands of miles of track. Large terminals handled immense volumes of passengers and freight. Maintenance shops employed substantial workforces. The industry represented one of the largest and most sophisticated systems ever created. Yet even at the height of its success, signs of future competition were beginning to appear. The source of that competition initially seemed modest. A new technology was emerging: the automobile. When automobiles first appeared, many people regarded them as curiosities. Early vehicles were expensive. Road networks remained underdeveloped. Reliability could be uncertain. Few observers immediately recognized how profoundly automobiles would reshape transportation. Railroad executives generally viewed automobiles as a limited threat. After all, trains possessed clear advantages. They could move large numbers of passengers efficiently. They could transport heavy freight. They already served established routes connecting major population centers. For a time, these assumptions appeared reasonable. However, technological progress continued. Automobiles improved. Production methods advanced. Costs gradually declined. Perhaps most importantly, governments and communities began investing in roads. The development of better roads expanded the usefulness of automobiles. Drivers gained greater flexibility. Unlike trains, automobiles did not require tracks or schedules. Individuals could travel when they wished and choose their own routes. This freedom appealed to many Americans. The cultural significance of the automobile became increasingly apparent during the early 20th century. Personal mobility offered a new kind of independence. Families could visit locations not directly connected to rail lines. Businesses could reach customers in different ways. Rural communities gained new transportation options. The automobile did not immediately replace the railroad. Rather, the two systems coexisted for many years. Each possessed strengths and weaknesses. Railroads remained highly effective for moving large quantities of freight and serving heavily traveled routes. Automobiles excelled at flexibility and personal transportation. Meanwhile, another challenge emerged: the airplane. At first, aviation seemed unlikely to compete seriously with railroads. Early aircraft carried limited numbers of passengers. Technology remained immature. Costs were high. Yet aviation improved rapidly, particularly after the First World War. Over time, airplanes offered increasingly attractive options for long-distance travel. A journey that might require days by train could eventually be completed in hours by air. Railroads now faced competition from two directions. Automobiles challenged passenger travel on roads. Airplanes challenged long-distance travel through the skies. The changing transportation landscape forced railroad companies to adapt. Some invested in improved passenger services. Others focused more heavily on freight operations. Technological innovation continued within the industry. Steam locomotives became more powerful. Schedules became more efficient. Infrastructure improved. Yet larger economic and social changes were underway. The Great Depression of the 1930s created additional difficulties. Economic activity declined. Many businesses struggled. Transportation demand weakened. Railroad companies faced financial pressure. Then came the Second World War. The war temporarily increased demand for railroad transportation. Troops moved by train. Military supplies moved by train. Industrial production generated heavy freight traffic. Railroads played a crucial role in supporting the war effort. For a time, passenger numbers increased significantly. Yet the long-term trends remained unchanged. After the war, automobile ownership expanded dramatically. Suburban communities grew. Highway construction accelerated. Commercial aviation advanced. The transportation environment of the mid-20th century looked very different from that of the late 19th century. The railroad was no longer the only practical option for long-distance travel. Competition intensified. Passenger rail services faced growing challenges. Some famous routes survived. Others disappeared. Railroad companies increasingly concentrated on areas where trains retained strong advantages. The age when railroads dominated nearly every aspect of transportation was gradually coming to an end. Yet this decline in passenger dominance should not be mistaken for irrelevance. The railroad remained deeply important. Freight traffic continued. Industrial supply chains continued. Economic activity continued. The industry adapted rather than vanished. And as Americans embraced automobiles, highways, and airplanes, they often overlooked an important reality. Many of the systems supporting modern life still depended upon railroads. The iron road that had helped create modern America was preparing to enter a new era. An era defined not by expansion across empty spaces, but by adaptation within a rapidly changing nation. By the middle of the 20th century, the United States was entering a transportation age that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the railroad pioneers of the 1830s. Automobiles filled city streets. Highways stretched across the landscape. Commercial airplanes connected distant regions in a matter of hours. For the first time since the rise of the railroad, another transportation system appeared capable of matching and in some cases surpassing the influence of the train. The change did not happen overnight. Railroads remained vital during the years following the Second World War. Freight traffic continued to move through the national network. Factories still depended on rail shipments. Coal, steel, grain, timber, and countless other commodities traveled by train. Yet passenger transportation was changing rapidly. Millions of Americans embraced the automobile. The appeal was easy to understand. A train could take a passenger from station to station. An automobile could take a family directly from home to a chosen destination. The flexibility was revolutionary. Travel no longer depended entirely on schedules. People could decide when to leave, where to stop, and which route to follow. This new freedom became closely associated with American culture. Road trips entered the national imagination. Motels appeared along highways. Restaurants catered to travelers. Entire industries developed around automobile ownership. The federal government also played an important role. One of the most significant infrastructure projects in American history began during the 1950s. The Interstate Highway System. Supported by President Dwight Eisenhower and authorized through federal legislation, the project created a vast network of modern highways connecting cities and regions throughout the country. The scale of the undertaking was extraordinary. Thousands of miles of roads were constructed. Travel times declined. Commercial transportation became more efficient. Automobiles and trucks gained new advantages. For railroads, the consequences were substantial. Passenger trains faced increasing competition. Many routes experienced declining ridership. Travelers who once depended upon rail service often chose automobiles instead. The challenge became even greater as commercial aviation expanded. Air travel had existed for decades, but technological improvements made it increasingly practical and affordable. Aircraft became larger. Safety improved. Airports expanded. A journey that might require several days by train could now be completed in a single afternoon. Business travelers particularly appreciated the time savings. The airplane transformed expectations regarding speed. Railroads could not easily compete in that area. The result was a gradual decline in many passenger services. Famous trains that had once symbolized luxury and prestige struggled to remain profitable. Some companies reduced schedules. Others discontinued routes entirely. Railroad stations that had once welcomed enormous crowds often became quieter. To observers during the 1950s and 1960s, it sometimes appeared that the age of passenger rail travel was coming to an end. Yet appearances can be misleading. While passenger traffic declined, freight railroads continued performing work that few other transportation systems could match. Moving heavy bulk commodities remained one of the railroad's greatest strengths. A single freight train could transport enormous quantities of cargo with remarkable efficiency. Coal remained important. Agricultural products remained important. Industrial materials remained important. The railroad adapted by focusing increasingly on these strengths. The industry also experienced significant consolidation. Throughout the 19th century, hundreds of railroad companies had operated across the country. Over time, mergers and reorganizations reduced that number. Larger systems emerged. Companies sought greater efficiency and stronger financial positions. The process was not always smooth. Some railroads faced bankruptcy. Others required restructuring. Government agencies became involved in various aspects of regulation and oversight. One particularly important development occurred in 1971. That year, a new organization assumed responsibility for most intercity passenger rail service in the United States. Its purpose was to preserve passenger transportation that private railroad companies increasingly found difficult to maintain. The creation of this system reflected a recognition that passenger rail still served important public needs, even if it no longer dominated transportation. Meanwhile, freight railroads continued modernizing. The transition from steam locomotives to diesel locomotives improved efficiency. Diesel engines required less maintenance. They consumed fuel differently. They offered operational advantages that made them attractive replacements for steam power. By the late 20th century, steam locomotives had largely disappeared from everyday railroad operations. The image of a steam engine remains closely associated with railroad history, but modern rail transportation relies upon different technologies. Computer systems gradually improved scheduling and logistics. Communication technologies advanced. Containerized shipping transformed freight transportation. Intermodal transportation became increasingly important. A container might arrive at a port by ship, travel inland by train, and complete its journey by truck. Each transportation mode contributed where it was most effective. Rather than existing in isolation, modern transportation systems became interconnected. The railroad found a valuable place within that larger network. Environmental considerations also encouraged renewed interest in rail transportation. Moving freight by rail often requires less energy per ton than moving the same cargo by highway. As concerns regarding fuel consumption and efficiency increased, railroads retained important advantages. The industry that had once depended upon steam engines and telegraph wires continued adapting to changing circumstances. Throughout these transformations, the legacy of the railroad remained visible everywhere. Cities still reflected routes chosen generations earlier. Economic patterns still reflected transportation decisions made during the 19th century. Countless communities owed their existence to railroad connections. Time zones remained part of daily life. National markets remained interconnected. Corporate management practices first developed by railroads continued influencing modern business. The railroad's impact extended far beyond transportation. It had shaped the geography, economy, politics, and culture of the United States. Perhaps most importantly, it had changed how Americans understood distance. Before railroads, crossing the continent seemed almost unimaginable for most people. After railroads, national connection became an expectation. The railroad helped transform a collection of regions into a more integrated nation. It accelerated migration. It supported industrialization. It encouraged communication. It created opportunities while also generating conflicts and controversies. Its history included remarkable achievements, as well as difficult consequences. Like many powerful technologies, the railroad brought both benefits and challenges. Yet its overall influence on American development is difficult to overstate. Even today, freight trains continue crossing the continent. Passenger trains continue serving travelers. Tracks laid generations ago remain in use. The railroad is no longer the newest technology. It is no longer the dominant symbol of progress. But it remains one of the most important foundations upon which modern America was built. And if we listen carefully beneath the noise of highways, airports, and modern cities, we can still hear echoes of the age when iron rails connected a continent and helped create the nation that exists today.